Elizabeth Toohey is an associate professor of English at Queensborough Community College and teaches journalism and advises the Queensborough student newspaper, Communiqué. Dr. Toohey is a regular contributor to the Christian Science Monitor. She reviews novels and nonfiction women's studies. She's big into film and American culture, especially post 9/11 culture, and a lot more that we will get to in this conversation. Professor Toohey, welcome. It's nice to see you again.
Thanks. It's great to see you, Mike.
Hey, I want to first talk to you about media literacy, if we could, especially with what's gone on over the last few years, the fake news, the news sites that aren't news sites, slant and biases and so forth, because I know you're an advocate, a really strong advocate for media literacy. It's an essential tool that students need to have in their toolbox, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is my big project right now. This is what I'm writing on and advocating for, is teaching more media literacy as a core or a basic skill at the college level. Because as we saw, I mean, so many adults in this country can't, whether they're educated or not, frankly, can't navigate the media landscape. And then that leads to things like the riots in January.
Elizabeth, your journalism students, I know their insight, the diversity of voice that they bring to your classrooms, their critical eye. You've told me you've learned so much from your students and that they learn so much from each other. Tell me a little bit about what you've all learned maybe over the last year.
Oh, we've had such great discussions, even being remote. This fall, I always do a big unit on media literacy, fake news, discerning between that and bias or slant or all these gradations.
Yes.
And so this fall, I mean, the syllabus is dynamic. It's never static because there are always things coming up in the current news that are so relevant and important to talk about. And especially with regards to the question of media literacy, we this fall did an activity where we were looking at news that fake news or unreliable news that had been delivered about COVID. And how to discern between more and less reliable websites in a way that isn't simply going through a library search engine. But when you're looking at extremely contemporary breaking news, how do you know what to trust? I mean, this is such an issue in our media landscape now, whether it was with the recent presidential election and all the disinformation swirling around who won and voting machines and all that, or issues around COVID and safety.
Which are life and death issues for us.
Exactly. So so we've had some good discussions, albeit remotely, this year. And then in the past, when I began teaching journalism, when I began teaching at Queensborough, that was 8 years ago now, I think. Yeah, I mean, it was a completely different media landscape, but I was amazed at how savvy many of my students were, especially to issues around bias in journalism and just more offbeat but insightful sources. And I learned so much from them, from the way they approach the news. But then, on the flip side, some of them, especially with the landscape changing so much, didn't have a super savvy way to approach sources online and media news sources. So that was something we had to talk about. And again, it's the joy of it and the challenge of it is that it has been a shifting landscape since the day I started teaching.
Well, how are they consuming it these days? What are their news sources? What are they relying on? How much of their news sourcing goes to long established, well-known brands like the New York Times or the Washington Post?
I think that this is part of the problem, and not just with our students, but with all news consumers these days, or the vast majority, I'll say, is that news consumption is no longer intentional, in terms of deciding what source will I go to. Oh, I'll go to my New York Times app. or I'll go to my National Public Radio app, or choose your source, Washington Post. It's our students, as I think is the case with so many people out there, are just reading whatever comes up on their news feed, on their social media feed is
Right.
what I mean. And then also what's not Facebook, right? Facebook is for like old fogey Gen Xers like me, but whatever is coming up on their social media as a news feed. And yeah, I think the idea of reading laterally, reading or like checking out and thinking about the source versus just reading whatever a friend is posting or whatever's popping up is a novel idea for many of them. Now, I will say many of them are being deliberate about not consuming too much news. And that was really interesting to me to hear. I had a class maybe just a year ago when we were still meeting in person that was so moving and nuanced about, it was the first day of class, about talking about how some of them were avoiding the news for mental health reasons.
Mm.
It was just too much coming at them all the time, too heavy, too depressing. And, if one were to say, oh, my students aren't reading the news, it could sound like a criticism, or, oh, those students who they just don't care about what's going on in the world. Not at all. They were being deliberate in a certain kind of way that then we had to tease out, well, how can we consume the news in a way that isn't detrimental to our mental health and where we know it's reliable? And, interestingly enough, we had that conversation, and I certainly didn't shame anyone. I just kind of let it sit. And we went on with the semester, and it was fascinating to me how many of them wrote in their evaluations at the end of the semester that they were consuming more news. They were in whatever form, I'll say reading, and that they felt the class had taught them the value of that. But I think it was just forming a community in our classroom over the course of the semester, hearing what other students were reading and how they were interacting with the news, maybe learning about some sources they didn't know before, like The Root, which is very good. I think that all influenced them. They were influenced by each other much more than, again, if I'd stood up there with a PowerPoint and given them a big lecture. And I think they were also influenced because built into our journalism course is writing for our community newspaper. And I think just that act of doing the research and reporting and writing for our own community made them look at journalism out there in the wider world differently.
What do you think is causing them to enter a field that is so dynamic, that is so charged, that in many respects is shrinking, but also there are pop-ups and new divisions and new organizations turning up all the time?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's what's driving them, is that need that young people are seeing to young people are seeing the bias that's been baked into journalism because it has been so dominated and still is by white people and by men. I think that many young people going into journalism are aware of that and trying to represent differently, and seeing, even if it's a shrinking field, that there is this need to approach the news through different lenses, and through people who maybe have access to certain communities through multiple language they speak, through insider connections into various immigrant communities, through a more, frankly, working class perspective.
Yeah.
The Times is reliable, but I've really seen its limitations. And honestly, I've been more attuned to them since I've been teaching at CUNY and at QCC. So, I think that women and people of color are vastly underrepresented still in newsrooms. And that affects the nature of the stories that are pursued, the nature of the questions that are asked, the nature of the people who are interviewed. So I really think representation is where it all has to start.
So, Elizabeth, outside of teaching journalism, you are a journalist. You report for the Christian Science Monitor. How did that start?
Oh, that began when I pitched to the editor there, and I said, I'm an English professor, and here are my areas of specialty, and I'd love to become a book critic and do some freelancing for you as a contributor. she looked at my background and said, we could use someone on the women's studies beat. We don't have anyone where that's what they specialize in. And why don't you try writing a review of this book? And the book she handed me was by Gail Collins, who actually writes for the New York Times. And it was called When Everything Changed. And it was about the journey women have made, American women, since 1960. And it was a fabulous book. I loved reviewing it. And that was the beginning of my reviewing at the Monitor. And initially, really, many of the books, most of the books I was reviewing related in some way to women's history, or at least centered women. And since then, I've expanded out into also reviewing fiction. And a few times she's thrown me books on New York or books on education, knowing my background. But yeah, it all began with how much I love writing about cultural issues and historical issues dealing with women. I've done a biography of Julia Child. I reviewed recently a really interesting novel that was a sort of what if Hillary Rodham had never married Bill Clinton. And it was a sort of fantasy fictional version of her life and where she might have landed, by Curtis Sittenfeld, who I think is a really fun, smart contemporary novelist. So that's been a big part of my beat.
Are you always reviewing a book in your head, even if you're just reading it for pleasure?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I always was before I became a reviewer. So it really has been a perfect fit for me. And I like the variety. I know for a lot of academics, they like going deep into one very specific area. And I mean, I have my areas where I have more depth to, like you mentioned earlier, contemporary literature that's post 9/11 that somehow reflects on that era. But, that being, and women's studies, but that being said, I like being kind of a generalist too, and just seeing what's out there in contemporary fiction.
You recently investigated and explored a very popular book, Behold the Dreamers. It follows a couple. They're newcomers to America. They harbored dreams of success after 9/11. Tell me about that book.
Oh, it's such a great book. I'll do a little, I have it on the table here, so I'll show you. This is it. Yeah, it's by Imbolo Mbue. And she herself is a young American immigrant from Cameroon, novelist. And this was her first book. I love reviewing debut novels and giving a shout out to those authors. I think it's just an incredible portrait of this couple who are immigrants. One is undocumented, and what life is really like trying to make it in the US. I think it came out in 2016, right before Trump was elected. And it feels very prescient in that regard. It deals with race, and definitely with that feeling during the Obama era that of people thinking or saying we were in a post-racial society, but of course not really being, as was revealed all too glaringly in the years to come.
Right.
But what's also was fun for me about it is that the character of the wife, this character's name is Nenny, is a CUNY student in the novel.
Right.
And I thought to myself here, I feel like that was the first time I'd seen that, at least in maybe such a prominent novel. She's a student at BMCC, and she's working so hard while she's trying to balance the needs of her family. She's, of course, working a job too. They have a young son. She becomes pregnant towards the end of the novel. So she's juggling her family. And there's this very understated, moving scene of her after she makes dinner for everyone and helps her son with his homework and helps her husband with some things, sitting down at midnight to start her own work for her CUNY classes. And it rang so true with all the needs everything our students are balancing, you know? So I loved that. I mean, among other things about the novel. And there's also, I was just reminded, yet another scene where there's a professor, a CUNY professor, who meets her in Bryant Park to help her with her work because she is struggling. And he says, well, you know, rather than coming down to BMCC, I'll meet you here and we can get a coffee. And she just supports her with some things she's struggling with. I think it's in a math class. And, you know, the whole novel is such a real feeling portrait of New York and different social classes. She and her husband are working for a very wealthy man and his wife. He is involved in finance, but you're seeing all kinds of slices of middle and working class people, and it's just a lovely novel. So one of the benefits too of reviewing is I was assigned this book by the Monitor, and then I loved it and I wrote a review of it. That review actually ended up being published in an anthology of award-winning authors that year. So that was nice to have that happen. But I felt like there was so much more to say about it. And I went on to write a journal article for the peer-reviewed journal Studies in the Novel. It was a special issue that was dedicated to post-colonial, post-9/11 novels.
Oh,
Yeah, so I've been writing on it for a little while now. Yeah, and it's really a wonderful piece of fiction.
you're also a visiting Nieman Fellow at the Nieman Institute for Journalism at Harvard. Um, how did that come about, and what do you want to achieve there? I know you have a real focus on immersive journalism education at community colleges, but share more with me about that.
Sure, I do. I'm so excited to be affiliated with Nieman and to have access to their resources and have their support. They're just a great institute that studies journalism. And to be honest, most of the Nieman Fellows are working journalists, and the projects they pitch relate to their journalism. I'm kind of the rare bird who pitched as an academic, pitched a proposal that was about pedagogy. And I never saw myself as someone who would would have a fellowship in journalism a decade ago. I mean, all this came into being because of my teaching journalism and just, again, these wonderful discussions with students in my journalism classes at QCC. So with Nieman, the proposal I pitched was I keep saying pitched, right? Like a journalist proposed, was to work on a curriculum that's specifically for public universities and community colleges that's teaching writing through teaching journalism, and with an emphasis on media literacy, but also with an emphasis on how important it is to attract more of the kinds of students who are at community colleges and public universities into working in the field of journalism, because people of color and women are still so underrepresented in news media outlets and newsrooms and among editors. And that underrepresentation leads to real issues of bias in the kinds of stories that are pitched and written, or the way they're covered, or the people who are interviewed. And I really saw with my students just the incredible work they were able to put out, these incredible stories with really different angles than we're used to seeing in mainstream media. And I think largely it's because of, not always, but often coming from first generation college students, families, from immigrant families, from more working class families. And again, because of all the racial and cultural diversity. So my proposal to Nieman really emphasized not just that our students in community colleges and public universities like the CUNY colleges need more media literacy, they do, but also that they have something incredible to give. many of the journalism classes have this campus newspaper folded into them. And what I
Right.
mean by that is so many of our students don't have time for extracurriculars. I mean, some of them do, and that's wonderful, but many of them don't. And so part of the way we've kept the newspaper strong is by building building the club activities of teaching them how to research and write stories into the landscape of the classroom. And that's one of the, I mean, yes, we read articles about journalism, and we read pieces of textbooks about some fundamentals to get down the basics of like how to conduct a good interview, that sort of thing, how to conduct research, how to structure a story effectively, organizationally. Right. But much of what we do too is just, it's like throwing them into the deep end of the pool right away, or like an immersive language class where you take someone who doesn't speak Spanish or whatever language and just put them in a classroom or in a country where everyone's speaking Spanish and say, okay, you'll pick it up. And our students pick it up in spades. And it's really an amazing thing to watch. So my work at Harvard will be writing about that experience, doing more research on the landscape of journalism and pedagogy today, and ultimately creating a curriculum and writing a rationale for it about why this is so important and how it should be done.
How does being a journalist make you, for example, a better science fiction writer or historical writer or romance writer?
I'm going to answer your question regarding works of fiction, but I would say, I would expand it and say what makes them a better writer in any field. I mean, also in history and in the social sciences, in the natural sciences, is these students are learning to hear other voices. And along with, I mean, because I think that sometimes what gets foregrounded is memoir or personal narrative. And when students are learning to write. Yep. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I've done that. Many of my colleagues do that. But part of what teaching journalism has made me think about is what would happen if we began not with the self, but by decentering the self. Right? Not erasing the self, not saying, okay, I'm going to try to be totally unbiased like a robot, and I'm going to pretend my own experience doesn't exist. I mean, I don't think that's fruitful. But again, taking your own experience and putting it to the side and centering someone else's. And, when our students have a story they're writing about how students on campus are experiencing something, remote learning, for example. There were a few articles posted on that this fall. I tell them, go talk to a variety of students. Back in the day when we were on campus, it was go stand in the Starbucks line or bother people in the Starbucks line or in the Science Center. We'll be back there soon, right? Right now it's a little trickier, and I'll say, well, who do you know? Who can you reach out to? But, in a normal landscape, then I'm saying, make sure there are women as well as men. Make sure you're not just talking to your friends. Make sure you're talking to people who are from Queens, who are from Long Island, who have different experiences and therefore maybe different positions or opinions on whatever the issue is. And I think that is what we are so sorely in need of in our world today. I mean, this circles back to the question of media literacy. I think that in a funny way, I mean, the problem everyone has identified that led to people falling prey to fake news about the election or fake news about COVID is that we're in silos, right? And if we're teaching good journalistic practices, we're teaching students the value of talking to a diverse array of people about their different experiences. And I think that can kind of organically translate to not just going to one source, even if it's in a more academic class, a history class or a social science class, where maybe, or a literary studies class where maybe it would be more going to sources online or in the library, but still not just going to hear one voice. And we've talked quite a bit in these journalism classes too about confirmation bias, right?
Yeah.
That idea that the bias we all bring is that we want to see or believe news stories that confirm what we already believe, right? And I mean, it's awareness. Once you see it, that's the first step, right, to hopefully combating it. So yeah, I just think all these skills are not ones that are just useful for a journalist, but would make our world a better place. I don't mean to sound too utopian, but I do have that little strain many academics have of save the world, or my field will save the world. And it's for me, it's funny or ironic because I came in as a literary studies person. I never studied journalism myself. I just got into journalism through writing book reviews, which again was kind of sticking with literary studies, and then slid from that into teaching journalism. And again, now it's become a major field for me of research and pedagogy, and where I'm pinning my hopes on a better country and a better world.
That's what makes everything so interesting. We're never really sure what door opens to what's next.
Yeah. At the risk of sounding quite idealistic, but that's where I'm headed.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. It's so good to hear from you. I'm really interested in learning more about what happens at the Nieman Institute. So please keep us informed.
Hopefully I'll be there in person in the fall. We'll see.
Well, all the best with that. And thank you so much for your time today. I really loved our conversation and so nice seeing you.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks, Mike.